Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to our customer training webinar, Journyx Accountlink for QuickBooks. My name is Whitney and we appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us. Today's webinar will be led by Meredith Zackaritz, the Director of Product Management for Journyx, and Christy Steele, Senior Payroll Manager and Systems Consultant for AIMSourcing. AIMSourcing is the QuickBooks implementation partner for Journyx. On the screen now, you will see the agenda for today's webinar. We've designed the content so that the information will be useful whether you already have Accountlink for QuickBooks and you'd like to learn more, or if you're deciding if it would be a good fit for your company. We'll have a Q&A session at the end where you'll be able to ask questions. When you want to ask a question, you'll click the raise hand icon and go to meeting. Right now, everyone is muted, so when you have a question, I'll take you off of mute and introduce you. At this time, I'm going to hand the webinar over to Meredith Zackaritz.
Thanks, Whitney. Journyx Accountlink is a .NET app that you install on the same machine where you run QuickBooks. It allows you to pass information back and forth between QuickBooks and your Journyx site. Accountlink is supported for versions of QuickBooks Pro, Premier, and Enterprise that are also currently supported by Intuit. And in order to run properly, Accountlink must be installed using the same Windows account or login as was used to install your QuickBooks. Your login account must also have administrator privileges to install new software on your computer. Now, Accountlink provides you with the ability to automatically pull your employee and timesheet data into Journyx in order to set up your time and expense tracking for your employees and contractors. You can then send your employee time and expenses back to QuickBooks for the payroll processing and invoicing that you may need to do. Now, if you're starting from scratch, you can send all of your active employees, customer jobs, pay items, and so on from QuickBooks to populate your new Journyx site with that initial setup data. Now, if you already have your Journyx system set up and populated with data, you can also map your Journyx employees and projects and so on to the corresponding data in your QuickBooks file. For today's training session, we're going to show how to get started with a new Journyx system, populating it with QuickBooks data, but we'll also look at how mapping to existing data works. So let's go ahead and jump over to our programs. Now, in order to get started syncing data back and forth with Accountlink, you have to set up a few fields and options in QuickBooks, Journyx, and Accountlink. If you're not going to be mapping QuickBooks employees to existing users in Journyx, then you have to create two custom employee fields in QuickBooks that will determine those employees' logins and roles in the Journyx system when they're created by Accountlink. So let's go ahead and look at how we do that. I'm going to jump to our employee information. And under additional info, there are options to create fields in QuickBooks. So we'll go ahead and create our fields. Now, I have created the JX login and JX role fields already, but if we were to create them again, we'd simply type them in as such to create a new field. Now, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and activate these custom fields for employees because that's what we're going to use them for. Now, if I also want to bring my contractors over into the Journyx system because they'll be entering time, then I could also activate these fields for vendors and transfer vendors over, provided they have a login and role for the Journyx system. And now that I've activated them, we can see that these fields are populated with the information we need to make sure that Dan Miller has the correct access in the Journyx system. Now, employees who will be tracking time in Journyx are also going to need to be set up to accept that time data for paychecks in your QuickBooks file. And there are two settings that control this option. First, we're going to go to the General File Preferences. And there is a preference for tracking time at all, and that has to be turned on. So we have our time and expenses. So if we were set to no, there would be no way to transfer your Journyx time back to QuickBooks. So we have to be sure that that's turned on. And then the second setting is a checkbox that says you want to use your time data when creating paychecks, and this also needs to be enabled. This is something that's set for each employee. If we go back up to our payroll and employees, there is the option to turn this on by default so that every time you create a new employee, this option will be turned on, and we recommend that you go ahead and do this. So we want to be sure and use the time data to create paychecks, and that's in the employee's payroll information. So let's go back and be sure that Dan Miller here, who we're going to create, has his use time data to create paychecks option checked, and he does. So that's what we need to get time back into the system for him. Now, while there are other optional features that require some setup in QuickBooks, we're going to review those after we set up all of the required parts to start a sync. So we'll move on from here into Journyx and what's required for setup. And the first thing that we need to do is set up an account that we will use to run our Accountlink syncs. We call this our QB admin account. So we'll go ahead and set this up. Now this account does not log in to the Journyx system. It cannot log into the Journyx system. It is only used for Accountlink syncs, to run the sync for QuickBooks to Journyx. And you also do have to have a license key that enables this option. So you won't see this QuickBooks admin role that we need here unless you have it license key enabled. And so we set up that account so we can run Accountlink syncs. So that covers all the steps that are required to start syncing your data. Now there are some additional options that you can set up, and these options allow you to transfer data from QuickBooks fields to custom fields in Journyx. The first option that we'll look at is specific to the class information in QuickBooks. If you're wanting to track classes from either time or expenses, you can transfer your QuickBooks class information to Journyx and set it up to be populated as part of the standard time or expense record. So we'll go and look at where we do this. In order to track the class information in Journyx, you have to set up custom fields called either QuickBooks Time Class or QuickBooks Expense Class. We'll look at what we have set up in here. Now, you can associate the class information with any of the data in the time or expense record that you bring over from QuickBooks. So for time entries, oops, looks like I don't have them. Then we'll go ahead and set them up real quick. So for time entries, you could determine the class value based on the project selection, as an example, in the time entry. And that's what I'm going to set up right here. So we'll give it the correct name. And we're associating this with projects. So I could tie it to other items in the time record, like the employee or the service item or anything else that's included in the time record. Now for expense, let's create our class tied to our expense codes or expense items. And so whatever the user selects as an expense code will determine what value we get for the expense class. So we're going to do the same thing here, except track our classes for expenses right here. And that's all we need to do to ensure that our class information transfers from QuickBooks. Now, if there's other data that you keep in QuickBooks that you'd also like to transfer to Journyx, you can use the Journyx custom fields here to do this. Customers often transfer additional information about employees and customer jobs by matching up the field names in both systems. As an example, I may want to transfer my employee hire dates that I already have tracked in QuickBooks, and I can do that by setting up a user custom field in Journyx that has the same name as the hire date field in QuickBooks. Now, Journyx actually does have a user start date that controls when an employee is allowed to track time in the system, so we could just use that one and rename it to match the QuickBooks field so that the data will transfer. So there's our employee start date. Let's change this to match the QuickBooks field hire date, and by doing this name change, I ensure that the QuickBooks data will then transfer in with the employees. And you can do this for any types of custom fields related to other data, like I said, like customer jobs. Now, one last setting that this is going to be new to Journyx 9.1M1, so that's a maintenance release which is coming out in July, is a system setting that allows you to transfer mileage you track in Journyx as an expense to QuickBooks. So under third-party software, you will see a new option to include mileage as expenses when you're syncing to Accountlink. So if you use that mileage entry screen for employee miles, you'll be able to simply check this box to send that information back to QuickBooks as an expense. So now that we've got all our required configuration and other options set up, let's take a look at how the initial sync process works using Accountlink. Anytime that you want to pass data between QuickBooks and Journyx, you're going to run an Accountlink sync to do this. Now, you must have your QuickBooks file open in order to run an Accountlink sync, and it's very important that you don't change your QuickBooks file name or move it to a new location on your computer or network without assistance from Journyx support. That's because we keep Accountlink registration information in the same location where your QuickBooks file is saved. And so you could break your ability to run syncs if you move or change the name of your file. So the fields at the top of the sync window are for your Journyx site information. This is so that Accountlink can connect to your Journyx site. You enter the web address as well as your QuickBooks admin login and password. Generally, your sites will be on port 80 unless you have a port in the URL. Now, after you enter this information for the first time, as we're doing here, only a password is going to be required for future syncs. Below the login information are several options and settings. This first setting determines whether or not Accountlink will check for approved time and expenses in Journyx to pull back into QuickBooks. So if you're wanting to run a sync that simply updates Journyx with new information from QuickBooks, you could turn this option off. Otherwise, it's always going to check for new time and expenses to pull from Journyx to QuickBooks at the end of every sync. So we can turn this off for now. We're setting up our site. We know there's not any time or expenses to come over, so we can just turn that option off. This next setting allows you to ignore checking for new time or expenses in Journyx before a specified date. Now, when Christy goes into some of the more advanced tips on closing out periods, she'll explain when you should use this setting. The important thing to note here about this setting is that once you've ignored a particular period, you will never be able to transfer time or expenses from that period again. So it's a good idea to consult Journyx before using this setting and be sure that you understand exactly how it works. The next setting allows you to transfer your employees' sick and vacation time balances to Journyx if you manage accruals in QuickBooks. If you don't manage employee accrual balances in QuickBooks, you can manage them entirely in Journyx and set up complex rules for accruing paid time off using the Journyx accrual calculator. However, if you are using the QuickBooks feature for accrual balances, you can send these balances to Journyx where employees can reference them for requesting time off. These balances will also be adjusted in real time as the employee logs time off in Journyx. One thing to note, and you'll see here, you should only select the accruals option in future syncs after you have run payroll in QuickBooks. Otherwise, QuickBooks will override the Journyx balances that have been updated in real time. Now, after you run payroll in QuickBooks, the balances are adjusted for time taken. Now, if you don't use QuickBooks to run payroll, Journyx can assist you in setting up a dummy payroll to simulate the process and adjust the balances, so no worries there. The last setting allows you to preview a summary of the data that will be transferred. This is something that you can skip, so you can select this option to skip it if you don't want to check the data before syncing, but we'll go ahead and take a look at how preview works today. Now, when I'm ready to start my sync, I click on the Synchronize button. Accountlink then connects to both QuickBooks and Journyx in order to pull data from both systems so that we can match up data on what we call the Accountlink mapping screen. Now, it takes just a minute to load the data from both systems. into the mapping screen. The mapping screen allows me to do things like map QuickBooks employees to existing users in Journyx. It also allows me to match customers and jobs to Journyx projects, where you can break down your projects into more detail and then map the tasks back to QuickBooks jobs. Now on the mapping screen, I have tabs for each type of data that I'm transferring from QuickBooks or mapping to data in Journyx. Each data tab will show what is currently mapped and what is available for mapping. For example, in the Users tab, we can see that the 2 employees with JX logins in QuickBooks have time entry mappings set up already. One thing that's special about the Users tab is that employees must be mapped to a QuickBooks vendor if you want them to track their reimbursable expenses in Journyx. And we can do this by selecting the mapped employee and selecting a vendor from the list that QuickBooks provides. Now usually companies will set up vendors with the same name, the employee name, so we'd have a vendor named Dan Miller, but in this case we're just using a sample file, so I'll select the first vendor from the list, and now Dan is ready to track expenses in Journyx. Now I can also map QuickBooks employees to existing users in Journyx, so I already had Greg set up in my Journyx system, and so I can map him to his employee account in QuickBooks to ensure that he can track his time. Now, there are other options and settings below the mapping area, and some of the data tabs have settings specific to the type of data we're working with, and others of the settings are available for all or most of the data. So we're going to start with the settings that are common to most of the tabs. Now you see here the setting for changing names in Journyx to match the QuickBooks names. And what that does is allows you to determine whether or not users will see the names used in QuickBooks for your time and expense tracking data. Sometimes customers use job names or service item names in QuickBooks that wouldn't make sense to the employees when they're tracking time. So customers turn this setting off so that they can rename the data in Journyx to be more user-friendly when shown on timesheets. Then the data in Journyx can look different than the data in QuickBooks, but the mapping ensures that each piece of data still matches up between the 2 systems correctly. Now another option that's consistent for all of the time and expense record data points is this setting to leave fields blank in either time records or expense records. And you can use this setting if you don't want your employees to track the information in Journyx. As an example, you may not want your employees to select their pay items on their timesheets, so you could just leave the pay item blank in the time sent back to QuickBooks. Now, related to this setting is the send data to timesheet, to Journyx. And if you're not going to have your employees track pay items in the Journyx system, then there's no real reason to have them to transfer that data in the first place from QuickBooks. So you could basically select to leave a piece of data blank and also not send it from QuickBooks, and that would just happen when you didn't want to track that information in the Journyx system. Now, other options are specific to the type of data we're working with. So projects or customer jobs include an option to look at the QuickBooks status of a job to determine if employees will be allowed to enter time or expenses against that job in Journyx. So if the setting is turned on, employees will only see projects or jobs that are set to the in-progress status in QuickBooks. So the QuickBooks status of the job determines whether time can be logged against it in the Journyx system. Now the bill type or billing status tab is special because there isn't any data to transfer. There aren't field values to transfer from QuickBooks. And QuickBooks treats the billing status of time as a flag that's either on or off. So you're required to map at least one of the QuickBooks billing status options to existing bill types in the Journyx system. So this is what we have in the Journyx system, and we'll go ahead and bill or map them to the billing status types that are available in QuickBooks. And we've got our mapped value here. The expense code or expense item tab has a setting that allows you to choose how to aggregate the expenses that are added to QuickBooks as vendor bills. The default option is to group expenses for the period by user and source. However, you can also create bills at a more granular level by creating a bill for each expense line item, or you can summarize them more than the default by aggregating the expenses by source only. On the Source tab, you can opt to create vendor bills based on the source selected in the expense record rather than that employees mapped vendor that we looked at on the Users tab. So, for example, the employee source, we might go ahead and leave mapped to the employee's QuickBooks vendor, but charges booked to a company credit card source could be mapped to a vendor account for managing the credit card. And you could have a credit card account in here. We'll pick any vendor, but a credit card account that you would map then that source to. The last tab for classes simply confirms whether or not you have configured your Journyx system for the transfer of classes. And as you can see here, we have set up our classes. Now when we're ready to move on, if we have decided that we want to review or do the preview, that was that checkbox option we had on the front, then here we'll get a summary of what data is going to be created or modified. And then after we've reviewed this, we've finished setting up mapping and options, then we can begin the actual data transfer process. So Accountlink shows you the progress for transferring the data, and it's on the same screen that you'll see any notices or alerts if there's a problem with configuration that requires fixing. And so you can track the progress here of each type of data as it's transferred. Now, after the new Journyx site is populated with employees, customer jobs, service items, pay items, expense items, and class information, you may need to do some additional configuration in your Journyx system to ensure that everyone has the correct access to data on their timesheets, and also the correct supervisors are approving their time and expenses. When it's completed, you'll see that every step is checked or skipped, and then the close button shows up as an indication that you have successfully synced your data. So let's go ahead and go over to Journyx. There we go. Now when the data comes into Journyx, it's all put into that default all group that you guys are probably familiar with. However, we don't generally recommend using the all group because it gives everyone access to all of the data in the system. So you may need to move your employees to departmental or employee type groups like exempt and non-exempt, along with the appropriate pay items for each group. You may also want to create project groups that grant specific users access to a limited list of projects. For today's training, we'll just go ahead and use the all group in the interest of moving forward, but you know based on your configuration what group types you have and where you might need to move this data to ensure that people have access to only what they need to see. Now, in order to send time and expenses back to QuickBooks, you have to have fully approved those records. And that means that time and expenses will not be eligible for transfer until they've been approved at all levels of an approval plan. So we don't have any approval plans in our system yet, so we're going to go ahead and set one up. And assign users to it. Oops, and I see that my users are inactive. Let's correct that real quickly. If you'll remember, I set it up to transfer the hire date, and it looks like the hire dates. let's see, yes, my hire dates are in the future because we have a sample file. So let's fix that quickly. We would like our users to be active so that they can enter time in the system, but you can see how this quickly ties into giving the correct people access to the system. All right, now we'll go back and assign our approval plans here. And that is the last of what we need to do to be able to start tracking time and sending it back to QuickBooks. So real quick, we'll take a look at what the data looks like for one of the end users here, for Dan, that we've been working with. And we can see that he has access to all of his QuickBooks customer jobs. And if we chose to go with status, then of course our customer level would be reportable only. It wouldn't be selectable. And so we could only do jobs that were currently in progress. We've got our service items, our pay types, pay items, and then of course we mapped our billing status. Any comments or notes that Dan includes in here will also be sent back over to QuickBooks, so we'll have all of the details that we see here sent back to QuickBooks. And we'll submit that time for approval. And very quickly we'll approve that time so that we have some eligible records to go back in our QuickBooks sync. So here's Dan's time. He's only subject to one level of approval. So once we've approved it here, his time is now fully approved. And we can go back to run future syncs to ensure that our time gets transferred back to QuickBooks. Now, when the time comes back, you can view the details in each employee's weekly timesheet in QuickBooks. Likewise, you can see the expenses that were transferred back to QuickBooks in vendor bills. And as we see, we're just going to enter our password. This time we are going to transfer actuals. We've not run payroll, so we're not going to sync our accruals, and we can skip our preview and go. And so while we wait for this to happen, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Christy. That completes our review of how Accountlink works for setting up and maintaining your QuickBooks data in Journyx. Christy's going to go over more information about QuickBooks best practices and special considerations for keeping the two systems in sync. So let me hand over the presentation. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to get started with a few tips on QuickBooks. One of the things that we want to make sure is for invoicing the customer, the time that is charged or the time that is stored in QuickBooks should be charged at the level at which you want to do the total invoice. So if you need to do the total invoice on the customer, then the time needs to be stored in QuickBooks at the customer level. That means whatever project or customer job on the, now you can, in Journyx you can do more detail and you can have the jobs, and like Meredith said, you can map back to the customer, but that is where the total invoice will go, wherever the time is charged on each line. So you can have more detail in Journyx than QuickBooks, or you can charge at the job level. So it just depends on your company's needs as to where you would do that. I do recommend that you do some kind of test time in QuickBooks, that you enter it manually and populate the timesheet in QuickBooks so that you can test your invoice, so you know once you do that how to set up your Journyx site. Service items, you can put the bill rate on the service item individually. You can use a price level list and a bill rate level list in QuickBooks to override those rates. It's not going to be like, if you're really complicated, you may need to split out your service items a little more granular. But for the most part, it's pretty flexible, and the rates do not come from Journyx. They are set up in QuickBooks for invoicing. So posting to the labor cost in the general ledger, after you bring the timesheet over from Journyx, you would use the pay employees process to post the cost into the general ledger. This can be done through a fake payroll. You do not have to have a payroll subscription, and there's a manual process you can use to turn on the payroll. And so you can do it either with a real payroll through QuickBooks or a not. You don't have to actually do a real payroll. So next, I want to talk about employees and vendors as users. So vendors can be set up in QuickBooks to allow timesheet entry in Journyx. You would use that JX login and enroll, or you can map them manually if you've already got them in Journyx. It is recommended that you use a special service item that has both the cost and the price. There's a checkbox on the item that you can check that says the work is performed by a subcontractor or partner. That way, if you do a bill on the time to pay the vendor and you invoice the vendor, it will pick up the right cost or price. The employees will also be set up as vendors if you're using the expense module. Time transfers to the employee record for employees, and the expense goes to a bill under their vendor record. You can also, what I don't have on here is you can also set up other sources like a credit card, and you can send and override the expenses to go to a credit card vendor instead of the employee or the actual vendor. The groups we kind of talked about already, but just so you're aware, like if you have certain requirements like DCAA requirements, you may need to set up your groups by CLIN or by employee, whatever it is needed to reduce the errors on your timesheet so that when the time comes back to QuickBooks, you don't have a lot of corrections to be made. The JX login and enroll that we talked about earlier, that's required for setup to bring employees over. If you choose to change a role, let's say someone becomes a manager that was just a user, you would want to go to QuickBooks and change it in QuickBooks and then run Accountlink. If you just change it in Journyx, the next time you run Accountlink, it'll be overridden. So if you're storing that data in QuickBooks, you would want to fix it there. So I'm going to talk about period closing and a little bit about time transfer or expense transfer. Prior periods, there's a setting in the configuration where you can say prior period adjustments are not allowed. And I would recommend that when you're doing QuickBooks transfers so that an administrator or a super approver has to know about a reopened timesheet after it's been approved. One thing I recommend as well, and actually I recommend this to most clients that administer timesheets, you should submit all blank sheets and approve them. If an employee is active but isn't required to have a sheet for that period, this closes your period so that people can't go back and enter time that you're not aware of. So if you've got the prior period adjustments not allowed and you have this, you've got all the sheets closed, there won't be any surprises on the timesheets for prior periods. I always check the user compliance report in the approvals menu. Now, if you're in an older version of Journyx, it might be in the reports menu and have a slightly different name. But the user compliance report in the current version is the one that you can look for late time. And that way you don't assume that all your time is in and approved just because you don't see any open approvals. So I do that as a control so that I'm aware of any changes after the fact. Because when you send the time over to Journyx, once you've sent it the first time, if you reopen a sheet and edit, you can end up with negative time records trying to come back to QuickBooks. And so the best thing I try to do is to use that transfer actuals on and off in Accountlink. And we also use that ignore records field in Accountlink to try to help reduce issues with any changes. You have the choice of letting the records be edited and sent to QuickBooks. And then you'll get a pop-up that tells you it won't allow, QuickBooks just doesn't allow a negative. And so you'll get a pop-up from Accountlink to tell you that it couldn't make this change. And so you would let the positive changes go over to QuickBooks, and then you just have to remove anything that was the minus. One of the things that I might recommend for expenses is that you have an extra admin level for approvals. That will allow you to control when expenses go over, partly because you could have a whole month's worth of expenses, but you want only 1 week at a time to go into a bill, or you just don't want, expenses get approved at various times, and maybe you just don't want those to go over anytime you click the transfer actuals. So that might be a consideration. And this is all just to kind of control your data and be aware of what's coming into QuickBooks. So that's the end of my part of the tips and tricks.
All right, thanks, Christy. We can go ahead now and start our Q&A. As a reminder, if you have a question, you're going to click the raised hand icon in GoToMeeting, and I'll take you off of mute and introduce you. Another reminder, if you're using both your phone as well as voice over IP, you might want to choose one or the other, because if you use both, we'll get a lot of feedback when you're trying to talk. And then lastly, if for some reason this doesn't work, you can type your question down here at the bottom, and I can read it off for you. So it looks like Shimon Hai has a question, so I'm clicking you off mute. You can go ahead. Are you on there? Is it Shimon? Am I saying your name right? Well, he also typed his question, so why don't I go ahead and read it here. It says, what if there was an error in Journyx and you need to resync? How easy is that?
Okay, so if you have an error in Journyx, you can reopen the sheet, edit it, and then if you reapprove it and send it back over to QuickBooks, like I said before, it will try to send a minus for anything you removed and a plus for anything you added. And so let's say you changed it from PTO to holiday a day because they put the wrong thing in. You would fix it, resubmit, reapprove, and when you send it over, it'll send the holiday, and it won't remove the 8 hours of PTO. So you would have to still go in and edit the PTO out. It will give you a pop-up, and it'll be in your logs, which I think we forgot to mention that there are logs that you can go look at to see any of your errors. And that's not really an error, it's more of a flag.
All right, and I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this moment. Does anybody else have any questions that either Christy or Meredith could answer? If so, you can click on that raised hand icon. Let's see. Okay, so Brenda Smith has written in a question here. It says, is it possible to specify a mileage rate for each project in Journyx? We have projects that have different mileage rates.
I'm not sure. You can't do that in Journyx. You have to do the rate by the. Oh oh, Meredith, are you there? I can't remember the name of the field. The measurement field?
So there's a field where you define the rate of miles to currency. It is called the measurement field by default. What you can do is set up project dependencies, and that's where when you select a specific project, it limits your measurement option to the one that applies to that project. So it is possible to do it. It's just you don't specify that mileage rate at the project, in the project fields. You tie the project to the measurement that has the correct rate. So it is possible to do.
So basically you would have to have a mileage rate set up for each type of rate and then apply it to the correct project.
Yes, exactly.
And Brenda, I've taken you off of mute. Does that answer your question? For some reason that is not wanting to work. Okay, if not, just type it in again at the bottom and we'll get to it. All right. Okay, she says yes that it did. Okay, all right. Anything else here real quick? I'm going to send an email this afternoon with some detailed information to support the content that we walked through today. So if you think of a question or need anything else, you can just respond back to the email that I send you. And also, we've been recording this webinar, so what we're going to do is we're going to get it put in our Journyx user community so you can share it with others or take another look at it. So I'll send you the link for the recording as well. That might not be today because sometimes it takes a little while to get it up, but I will in the next few days. So we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today, and enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again.